Welcome to ArtBreak, the lecture series dedicated to seeing art through a different lens. Each session features a speaker who gives insight into their worldview by sharing their interpretation of works of art at the CMA. The current exhibition in discussion is Black is Beautiful, the Photography of Kwame Brathwaite, an exhibition spotlighting the art and activism of the Second Harlem Renaissance. Today we welcome Dr. Todd Shaw, Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. If you are joining us live, please insert questions for Dr. Shaw in the Facebook chat, and stick around after for the live Q&A. And now, Dr. Todd Shaw.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to join you. Again, I'm Todd Shaw, and it's a distinct pleasure to join you on this day because in many ways, we're all at a moment of reflection. And this is what the Columbia Museum of Art is all about. It's about reflecting who we are, reflecting where we've been, and in this unique opportunity to reflect on the work of Mr. Kwame Brathwaite. I want to thank very much Wilson Bain, Nancy Tolson, Drew Barron, and all those who were responsible for this invitation. I'm humbled by this invitation, and would like just to share a few comments with you today, because my task today, or my charge today, was to talk about Mr. Brathwaite's work, mindful of how the activism of the day of the 1960s inspired his work, in what ways that activism is still very much alive today, although it's taken differing forms, but still inspired particularly by the images of Black political empowerment and Black consciousness of that day. So what I want to share with you, and I've labeled my comments sort of snapshots of liberation, thinking about sort of from Black is Beautiful, this wonderful exhibit of his work that is on, as you know, is on display at the Columbia Museum of Art until September the 6th. So this wonderful display from Black is Beautiful to Black Lives Matter. And I don't want to suggest that there's sort of this straight line between what happened in the 1960s and what's true now in the early 21st century, but there are some connections to be drawn, and sort of thinking about sort of the Akan and Dinkra symbol of Sankofa, going back to move forward. I want to move us back a little bit for us to think about in what ways this activism has moved forward. I want to, I may not always be able to give you the captions because I want to keep my comments short enough so that we have time for discussion. But what I do want to do is let you know that many of the works that you'll see and many of the photos I've selected from Mr. Brathwaite's work were sort of two criteria. One, I selected it because it moved me. And so this picture of sort of members of the Grandassa Model Company and also of the A-Jazz Society. This picture kind of moved me because it kind of brought together, in some ways for me, much of what he and his contemporaries were doing there in the 1960s forward. Whether it be sort of the fact using sort of the soul style and the Afrocentric or African-inspired designs of the Grandassa models, the sort of Black consciousness that is rooted itself in Garveyism but moves forward into the 20th century to be expressed in the Black arts and Black power movement, the music, the jazz, the soul, the bebop, the sort of the music implied by album covers, the naturally 1962 forward sort of extravaganzas of fashion and African-inspired style and music, all sort of found in this photo. And so throughout, I will show photos from the exhibit or from the sort of larger body of work. But also another sort of criteria was sort of that the work of Tanisha Ford, of Kwame S. Brathwaite, some of the photos that they, in some of their presentations to us, what photos that they found most compelling. That was sort of my second criteria for picking photos. What moved me and what moved them. Because I'm an observer to this work, but a happy member of this audience. Okay, so I want to sort of dedicate my comments today to the activism of African American women, who I think are and have been central to African American freedom struggles as long as there has been an African American freedom struggle. And so whether we're talking about the Grand Dasa models, and here we have Sekole Brathwaite with her Grand Dasa contemporaries, and the ways in which they were moved by the history and the connections to something deeper than simply the racial oppression of the day, certainly moved by Mother Africa and this appeal to reaching back to move forward. Or, as I'm showing you here on the right side, Patrice Color's Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza in the middle here, and the founders of Black Lives Matter. I think all of these women kind of reflect this sense of history, and without them, there would be no history in this sense, and no activism in a real sense, because these three women were founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And they began in 2013, Oakland-based, same Oakland, California, of the Black Panther Party. And of Assata Shakur, someone who they took as a guiding star, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, an activist, mother of Tupac Shakur, the hip hop artist. And but sprung that movement in 2013, based upon, of course, the death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman in Florida. Well, I think all of these women sort of symbolize this notion of we are the ones we've been waiting for. If you ever get a chance, look at the documentary on the life and times of Beulah Richards, or Beulah Richardson, the activist and actress Beulah Richards, because her activism in the 1940s preceded the activism of both these sets of women. But even these women in the 1940s and 1950s knew that they were a part of a history that was going to come to fruition, but come to fruition in their own sense of self. And so it was that documentary that introduced me to this phrase that's often in use of we are the ones we are waiting for. But I think it nicely encapsulates this activism of African American women. And I'll come back around to that, because I'm going to bookend my presentation talking about African American women being centered in this work, this broader cultural and activist work. So what I want to just do today is sort of facilitate a dialogue about the relevance of Mr. Brathwaite's work to and its relevance to today's notions of Black activism. I'll do it in a couple of ways. One, I'll talk about why culture matters to Black activism. I'll talk about the images and ideals that still matter, and I'm just going to show a few images. I'm going to leave it to you to go see the exhibit. The museum is socially distancing and observing all those practices, so feel free to do that. But there's also ways that you can view this work online. And then how are Black women still in focus, or still should be in focus as we look at these snapshots of liberation. I'm going to give some discussion to the Say Her Name campaign, the element to the Black Lives Matter movement that talks about the forgotten intersectionality of Black women's pain. And then I'll end with a brief reading list. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of highlight, and forgive me for the unforgivable typos here, but I want to talk about Mr. Brathwaite and the ways in which his work is so very relevant today, and why we're focusing on this in today's ArtBreak. So here's a self-portrait that he took of himself in, of course, in Harlem in 1964. And as I haven't had the wonderful opportunity to personally meet him, but just seeing his work, hearing from those who know him well, including his son, likewise reading his own words. He strikes me as this regally and eminently humble man. That what he and his brother Elam Bey started in the Bronx, New York, with the A Jazz Company, etc., and in the Grand Dassel Models, they were simply doing sort of the work they thought were important to senses of Black self-consciousness and Black pride. But in many ways, and I appreciate what the museum has done in bringing his work to Columbia, South Carolina, because in some ways he's one of those figures in Black sort of cultural history that we should know more than we do, and we can only know more by virtue of celebration of this work. Of course, I also want to give an important shout out to Tanisha Ford, whose beautiful book on his work and her beautiful sort of research about the women of the Grand Dassel Models is sort of the shoulders I stand upon to be able to present some of what I'm giving you today in background information. But Mr. Brathwaite was a Pan-Africanist. He certainly, because of the ways in which Garveyism motivated the vision of Carlos Cook, as I'll explain in a moment, who was one of his mentors, that likewise passed down Pan-Africanist principles to Kwame and gave him and his brothers and others this sense of this connection to Africa at the height of what would become sort of the African decolonization movement, the African liberation movement of the 1950s and 60s, as well as the civil rights movement and Black Power movement. So these are all critical moments. He is clearly a photojournalist, and you will see that by the breadth of his work. And the museum does, I think, it takes snapshots in what's able to be accomplished in limited time and space, but takes snapshots of the breadth of Black life that he covered, particularly in the 1970s. I was struck by the fact that not only, there were aspects to James Brown music life and career that he covered, but then also he went with the Jackson 5 when they did their sojourn to Africa. So there's a breadth of his work where he's capturing Black life. And I would say in that sense, being a documentarian to Black life. Now, these are some labels that he may not assign to himself, but I think it's very fair to say he, his brother, others who joined him were music producers. I mean, by virtue of the fact of what they accomplished in bringing seasoned and veteran jazz artists to Harlem, to the Bronx, Abbey Lincoln, Max Roach, and many, many others. And featuring them even as young people, that they were jazz, they fundamentally appreciated jazz, knew how intrinsic it was to Black life, how it was a creation of Black cultural life. And so I think in some ways he's clearly a music producer in all that he did. He's certainly also sort of a fashion producer in the sense of having some hand in the founding of the Grand Dassel Models, among others, of course. And so in that ways, and brought the beautiful presentation of African-American women in their natural hairstyles, which was revolutionary in the late 1950s, right? Late 1950s, a period of suits, of ties, of processed hair. Well, making that statement in the 1950s and early 1960s was actually something not short of revolutionary. And so in that way, bringing the unique style of African-American presentation of African inspired work and garments and headdresses, et cetera, which you'll see in some of the photos I discuss. And then clearly he was an activist, involved in sort of the Pan-African movement, involved in the Black Power movement, involved in sort of later aspects of those movements and the Free South Africa movement. In all these ways, his activism is clear. And then he was an entrepreneur. His father owned several businesses, sort of cleaning, laundromats, sort of really sort of a Garveyist principle of sort of Black business development and ownership. And so in this respect, then he likewise became an entrepreneur in his own right, particularly with the opening of the AJazz studio. And as we can kind of talk, and I'll just sort of read one paragraph from Ford that encapsulate this broader set of questions. Inspired part by the writings of Marcus Garvey, Kwame Brathwaite, his older brother Alambi Brathwaite, and African Jazz Society and Studio, so AJazz, popularized the phrase "Black is beautiful" in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Brathwaite brothers did their part to spread the idea through writings and photographs, as well as activities of the two organizations that they helped to co-found. AJazz in 1956 and adopt the Grandasa models in 1962. In the late 1960s, Brathwaite and his older brother, Alambi Brathwaite, became active in the African nationalist pioneer movement, the ANPM, led by Carlos Cook, and they were also involved in early struggles of the Southern Africa. In 1961, they formed the Bronx-based Southwest Africa Relief Committee to support Sam Njomo's Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, and later the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. Parallel to these political activities, the two brothers were regularly producing concerts as well as venues at Club 845 in the Bronx and Small's Paradise in Harlem. Brathwaite took on the role of photographing these concerts, promoting them, and organizing the cultural activities that he would be held during the concerts, such as the shows and African dance performances. So that's just a reason why we start with his wonderful work and then move forward. And so let me move forward. And hopefully you don't feel like I'm doing too much time jumping, but let me jump to today. So how can we draw some lines without doing too much, without drawing lines that are a little too dotted between then and now? What is true of Black is beautiful then versus, Black Lives Matter now? Well, I want to suggest that there are some seeds of ideas and images that I'll feature shortly in the remainder of my talk that were both inspired by sort of the Black Power, Black arts movement of the day of the 1960s. And many of the sort of the images that are true and framed within Black Lives Matter today have at least some aspects of their origins to what was true of the Black Power movement of the 1960s. Having said that, however, it's not important to say that activists were only borrowing from those images, because they were not. And I'll clarify that in a moment. Here is a wonderful photo, I think, of Black Lives Matter activists, and there's now a Black Lives Matter chapter among other sort of activist organizations here in Columbia, South Carolina. And I think this is sort of a wonderful photo sort of demonstrating the ways in which young African Americans are critical leaders within this movement. Young African Americans then, and in particular, those who have sort of important intersections in their Black identity, the Brathwaites having hailed from Barbados and being immigrants from Barbados, but clearly being steeped in Black culture, African American aspects of African American culture growing up in the United States. And then it's true of sort of the Pan-Africanist aspects of what you'll find true in Black Lives Matter, and I'll explain that as well. But Black Lives Matter has accomplished much. Now, and I could say a lot, but I only say this thus far. Let's just take into perspective a few things that they've accomplished just with the most recent protest, and I'll talk a little bit more about the scale of the recent protests in just a minute. But now we're seeing, and we all know, the world knows of those horrendous images of George Floyd being killed by that police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In the ways those images in late March sparked mass protests across the world, across the globe, centered around the fundamental concerns of Black Lives Matter. Well, just in this period of the last several months, this movement has accomplished, in many respects, have put on the front burner elected officials or prospective elected officials who are all tied in some ways to Black Lives Matter. For example, Charles Booker, who was a senator, who is a state senator in the state of Kentucky, almost challenged and almost won the Democratic nomination and wrestled it from Amy McGrath in Kentucky, came within a hair's breadth and was clearly steeped in the movement. Likewise, we had what has happened in New York, the election of young as well as young queer or gay African Americans to Congress. Whether we're talking about James Mondaire Jones, or we're likewise talking about, I think it's Jamal Brown, if I'm not mistaken. Recently, we had Jamal Bowman. Recently, we had Cori Bush, who ousted longtime Missouri Representative Lacey Clay. And Cori Bush was a Black Lives Matter activist in St. Louis. And challenged and effectively won the nomination from a longtime incumbent Clay of the Clay family. And she said, it is historic that this year, of all years, we're seeing a Black working class single mother who's been fighting for Black lives since Ferguson all the way to the halls of Congress. So just in that consideration, Black Lives Matter has made sort of fundamental differences. But we're seeing sort of the reform of the Minneapolis Police Department, the whole discussion of the reformulation of that police department into a public safety department. We have the legislation that's still pending in Congress, but I suspect if there's a Democratic Senate and House after November, the 2020 Justice in Policing Act, particularly taking on the issues of immunity among the police, as well as creating various other incentives for local police officers to be held accountable for deaths and violence. Then there's sort of what happened in New York City with Mayor de Blasio. Then in terms of making a commitment in shifting funds from that $6 billion budget in Los Angeles. Now Mayor Eric Garcetti also making a similar commitment. Dallas Police Chief Officer Renee Hall announced the implementation of a duty to intervene policy. And again and again, all of these instances where Black Lives Matter, just as a small indication of what they've done, have accomplished many things, I think, and there are many more things to come. So let's talk about the breadth of this movement. Black Lives Matter, according to this New York Times article, may be the largest movement in US history. And so this July the 3rd, 2020 article mapped out, well, how many individuals may have engaged in the protest by these various counts of these various data gathering organizations. So the Kaiser Family Foundation, if you just took a calculation based upon the representative samples, and they took these national representative samples, survey samples, and then sort of projected out, well, based upon who said they protested, what would that look like as a calculation of the larger population? And so the Kaiser Foundation, they calculated that maybe 26 million Americans, or 10% of all Americans, were engaged in the protest. Civic Analytics at 23 million, the National Opinion Research Center, 18 million, Pew Research Center, maybe 15 million. So very widespread. And widespread also from the standpoint of, if we go through the rest of and other articles with this Time story, sort of widespread in the sense of this map on the left side talks about the percentage of the population that is white in counties that had protests. So Black Lives Matter, but many others involved, and particularly white Americans involved on levels that seem unprecedented in recent American history. And so you see that not just in the, not just in the places where we have sort of the Black Belt and high concentrations of African Americans, but through those counties that don't have high concentrations of African Americans or have higher concentrations of whites, we saw mass protests. So somewhere on the order of at least 800 to 1,000 cities and towns got involved. And then we can see voters' net support for Black Lives Matter. A radical shift, as I'm sure you've heard in recent news stories. A radical shift in the number of individuals who support Black Lives Matter and those who going from support, non-support to support in a pretty dramatic shift. So in the last 2 weeks, as seen on the right side here, American voter support for Black Lives Matter movement increased almost as much as it had in the preceding 2 years. So that support was sort of below water according to general surveys. And this is just sort of back in 2018. And then by 2019, we're seeing sort of a 25-point shift in the direction of support. So somewhere in the area, depending on what question you ask, 60% of Americans lending some level of support for either the questions of racial equity or attacks upon and challenges to systematic racism. And again, I'm just naming some of the breadth of this movement. Okay, but let's get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is, how do cultural politics matter in all movements? And particularly, how do the cultural politics of Brathwaite's generation in the 1960s and what he accomplished with the AJAS society, with the Grand Dasa models, how did those cultural politics and activism matter then? And in what ways are there some linkages we can draw to Black Lives Matter and activism today? And so let me just sort of take a quote from Mr. Brathwaite. And this is in Tanisha Fort's book. And he says, and this is sort of the 2019 publication, "I was blessed to be part of a burgeoning art scene at a time when art, politics, and especially music converged. Whether it was the soul music of rhythm and blues and disco, the groovy soul sounds of jazz, the roots soul of reggae, the Caribbean soul of calypso, the soul-searching soul of gospel, the knockdown, drag-out soul of down-home blues, or the revealing soul of rap music, the essence of the Black experience prevails, carrying with it all those who dare to listen and try to understand. It is a feeling, a drive, an emotion that can be totally captivating. I've tried to capture that same feeling in my work. And I suspect this is what he would, and this is what he would be doing today. I'm showing you a photo of young African Americans and supporters who are in Washington, D.C. at the Black Lives Matter street mural, who are sort of dancing to hip hop beats. And this is sort of that what is now sort of Black Lives Matter Square, close to the White House, and this was in June 19th, June the 19th, 2020, and it marks Juneteenth, right? So there's the confluence of the cultural and political in the celebration of that important African-American holiday, Juneteenth, where the word was finally received in Texas of emancipation, of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the photo comes from an article that I can refer to you that I think was fascinating reading from Taina Steptoe. And Taina Steptoe, in a piece in The Conversation, wrote this commentary entitled, "Hip Hop is a Soundtrack to Black Lives Matter Protests, Continuing a Tradition that Dates to the Blues," right? And so in some clear way, there are observers, and more than a few, making connections of what is true now and what is true then. which is not to say, and I'll say this later in our conversation, which is not to say that the activists themselves always have to draw those connections, but those connections may in fact exist, even if they're not clear about what they are borrowing. Those connections, that sort of collective memory still matters. Okay, so let me just for a moment make a small contribution from the standpoint of what we as scholars have attempted to do in mapping the connections between culture and activism. And I wanted to say that the bottom line of this is that whether we're talking about my work, my book, 2009 book entitled "Now Is the Time: Detroit Black Politics and Grassroots Activism," or we're talking about a fascinating book by Sekou Franklin entitled "After the Rebellion: Black Youth Social Movement Activism and the Post-Civil Rights Movement Generation," or the book by Lakita Bonnet Bailey, "Pulse of the People: Political Rap and Black Politics." All of us as sort of theorists of activism or theorists of activism and culture say that there's one critical thing to all movements and why culture is fundamental to all social movements. And that is this concept we call framing. Framing is effectively giving individuals ideals and images that convey to them a narrative of why they should be concerned about a particular problem. Now, it can be trying to convince the marginalized why they should mobilize, or those in power and those who are the targets of protest as to why this problem matters. But for instance, Black Lives Matter in itself is a frame, right? It conveys in simple, profound language what is key to this movement. If Black life does not matter, then what fundamentally is wrong in our society, right? So, and that's often true of frames, that it takes just a little bit. It takes just a few words, a refrain of a song, an image, a cultural product to convey power and narrative. And let me sort of read just a small section from Lakita Bonnet, and then I'm going to move forward in my presentation. Because Bonnet talks about, in her book, that music is a form of resistance. And so she says, and the hip hop of today has its roots in the Black arts movement in the 1960s. So the hip hop music is the soundtrack of Black Lives Matter, has its roots in the Black arts movement in the 1960s. She writes, "It's widely accepted that rap music began with the Last Poets and the poetry of Gil Scott-Heron in the early 1970s. And cultural figures such as the Last Poets, for instance, the song Niggers Are Scared of Revolution, or Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, were premier poets of the Black arts movement of the 1960s and 70s. These poets developed unique African griot styles in which they recited poetry over musical beats. While this style can be described as one of the foundations of modern rap, it can be traced to the African-American oral tradition, right? So it's an even longer tradition, but still a framework within that broader tradition. Okay, so I wanted to kind of just make some of these connections, and now let me kind of move forward here. And let me sort of start with a connection between the activism of individuals like Abby Lincoln and Max Roach. Abby Lincoln and Max Roach were key to the Brathwaites and the Grandasa and the Ajaz Society's efforts. Particularly Lincoln and Roach were part of that first Naturally Black, that 1962 cultural extravaganza. And it has in the sense that them as headliners bringing in the people to create this sort of important cultural moment. So popular they had to do 2 shows. Well, I'll leave it to your care to go back and listen or re-listen to the work of Lincoln and Roach, particularly that important album We Insist, rooted in the civil rights movement ethos, or Afro Blue. Clearly, they were making ties between the sort of a larger sort of Pan-African cultural consciousness and the civil rights and Black Power movements in their music. But let me sort of, just for a moment, have us play a clip from the artist Dax. Dax, in his song on Black Lives Matter, Dax is of Afro-Canadian ancestry, but his family moved to the United States and has sort of became a bit of a phenom as a sort of rising hip hop artist by virtue of YouTube. So let me just ask for us to play his Black Lives Matter sort of soundtrack to key in that activism via music.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Yeah, this'll revolution in our time. Everybody's fighting, change coming, yes. That's why it's an acronym for riot. Everybody has a voice, don't you dare stay silent. If you say nothing, you are an accessory to violence. Let these words dry the tears of our people that are crying. We can bring back hope, but not the people that are dying. It's what happens when the people you've oppressed ask for change in the country that they built, but you've ignored and denied. This is Sandra Bland, George Floyd, and
so
every single
I'm sure that listening to that clip, that you're clear about how Dax framed, how he used the power of hip hop, the power of social media and YouTube, the power of images and words from that were captured actually by either photojournalists, journalists, or activists in these confrontations with police. I'm sure you're clear about how that framing can be quite powerful, and that framing's been going on quite a while. So let me talk about another sort of intervention from Mr. Brathwaite. And this comes again from Ford's book, in Capturing His Words. He says of himself, at 81 years old, she says of him, I'm sorry. At 81 years old, Brathwaite is now telling the tale of how he, the son of West Indian immigrants, and a crew of Black teens from the Bronx styled the world. It's not shocking that the world is now ready to listen. The movement for Black lives that has taken shape in the years following the brutal murder of Florida teen Trayvon Martin in 2012 has ignited a spirit of protest similar to that of the 1960s and 1970s. These young activists have also reclaimed the radical foremothers, such as Assata Shakur and Audre Lorde. They've embraced the artwork and inspired imagery of the day, mapping genealogies of cultural production. Tracing the roots of Black is beautiful. In doing so, they found Kwame Nkrumah and Ajaz and Grandasa, the pioneers of so much of the culture that now lives on splashy Tumblr pages in the Instagram feeds. I thought it was a beautiful paragraph where she encapsulates what I think of these ideals of radical foremothers, right? The radical foremother of reaching back to a broader Mother Africa and African diaspora, and the radical foremothers of the activist women. I'm showing you here a picture of the Grandasa model, Brenda Deaver. And in ways in which the women of the Grandasa models sort of presented images of a radicalism that was a transformative radicalism, that the transformative framing of the notion Black is beautiful, right? Sort of revolutionary in its day, and the Black is beautiful of then, the Black Lives Matter of today. But in some ways, there are these connections that exist from these powerful frames of activism and culture. So just very briefly, I want to kind of highlight some of the ideals that shaped sort of what is true then, what was true then, and what is true today. And we can unpack this later on. You know, whether it comes from the work of Carlos Cook, Carlos Cook was a and adherent and a follower of the Honorable the Honorable Marcus Garvey and Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which arguably was one, if not the largest Black social movement or cultural and political movement of the 20th century. Why do I say that? The work of Tony Martin, among many others, speak of Garvey and Garveyism commanding somewhere between 2 to 4 million members worldwide, which would have been an enormous number of individuals connected to the Garvey movement. When we're talking about African Americans being 10 to 11 million individuals in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. So Garveyism and its Pan-Africanism, it's certainly being rooted in this notion of reaching back to Africa and creating a sense of cultural nationalism. If nationalism is the attack upon racial oppression by creating an independent and sovereign nation in various ways, then cultural nationalism says one should be independent in your cultural thinking, in your cultural presentation. And certainly the influences of Malcolm X in going to Mecca and to Africa also fuel the aspects of the Black Power movement that would emerge as rooted partly in cultural nationalism. Although there are differences of cultural and various other nationalisms during the 1960s. So it's not, we've got to be careful about saying that it's all rooted in a unity of ideal. And then certainly economic nationalism, that Carlos Cook sort of gave the Brathwaite brothers this notion of buy Black as rooted in Garveyism. Garvey and the various businesses and leagues that he created, and certainly even though Garvey by 1941 and certainly in the 1950s was no longer, at the same time Garveyism persisted, particularly among, of course, those of Afro-Caribbean descent and African-American descent. And so this economic nationalism fundamentally mattered. And of course, the Brathwaite brothers would have had their own forms of economic nationalism in the fact that their father was a businessman and entrepreneur. And then Black womanism, this sense of that African-American women should be fundamentally empowered in their own right to be leaders within cultural movements. That's similar to sort of the revolutionary nationalism that the Black Panther Party, although revolutionary and cultural nationalism have collided in fundamental ways. We can talk about that later. But the revolutionary nationalism of bringing in Marxist and socialist principles to sort of Black nationalism, fusing these two as intersections to argue about the principled and fundamental stance of self-defense and peaceful but insistent revolution to bring about Black liberation. Or Black feminism and intersectionality. Clearly the work of Audre Lorde and Assata Shakur would have a direct impact upon the thinking of Colores, Tameti, and Garza as they founded, again, out of Oakland, the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the Black feminism being a more direct and asserted notion of expressions of Black womanism that would find their roots in the 1960s. Black LGBT and queer politics. It's no mystery that the Black Lives Matter movement is intersectional, partly because its founders, 2 of its 3 founders self-identify as queer. And so they understand and embrace their own intersections, and so does the movement. And then I think there's clearly a Pan-Africanism in Black Lives Matter. Although that Pan-Africanism extends to many, and it's not just Pan-Africanist in its sentiments. It certainly is rooted in the sense of the diaspora, and certainly how the Black or African diaspora has responded to the movement in support and solidarity. So let me just sort of conclude by talking about a few images. And let me again begin with Mr. Brathwaite's work, or his words, and compare his words to that of Alicia Garza of the Black Lives Matter movement. So he says, seeing the images of Emmett Till in 1955 was a turning point in our lives. With the photography as a medium of choice, I became an artist activist, imbued with the same entrepreneurial spirit as our father. My brother Olombe and I co-founded the Jazz the African Jazz Art Society and Studios, an ode to our love of jazz and the teachings of Marcus Garvey, and later the Grandasa models. Black is Beautiful was my directive. It was a time when people were protesting injustices related to race, class, and human rights around the globe. I focused on perfecting my craft so that I could use my gift. Compare his words to that of Alicia Garza. I created Black Lives Matter with Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi, two of my sisters, as a call to action for Black people after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder, and the killer, George Zimmerman, was not held accountable for the crime he committed. It was a response, BLM, it was a response to the anti-Black racism that permeates our society and also, unfortunately, our movements. So 3 images. So let's think, and I'll leave this more for our discussion. Let's think of the connections between how the way in which the brutal murder of Emmett Till in 1955 in Money, Mississippi, how that murder became the way in which that murder was different than others, because African Americans had been lynched throughout this period from the end of Jim Crow into the mid-1950s. But Mamie Till, or Mamie Till Bradley, the mother of Emmett Till, decided that she was going to have an open casket funeral and of Emmett Till's brutalized body. And Jet magazine then captured the pictures of his open cast and Mamie Till's grief-stricken image over the casket. And that became, by way of Jet magazine, a popular African-American magazine by Ebony Publishing, that became the hashtag of its day. The Emmett Till then, those images are likely the images that a young Brathwaite would have seen in the Bronx and Harlem and inspired his own activism. Similar to what was true for Trayvon Martin and the death of Trayvon Martin. And here he's being, I'm showing a picture of he and his mother, Sabrina Fulton, how his death, but also Black Lives Matter and the activism of his own mother became a way for these images to have profound impact in their day. The civil rights movement in Emmett Till's day, Trayvon Martin in the Black Lives Matter movement of today. By the way, Sabrina Fulton is running for office in Miami-Dade County as a county commissioner. Again, the Black Lives Matter movement still mattering in key ways, right? Then the second image I want to show is the image of the Grandasa models who were, as they picketed the Parisian wig, or the Whigs Parisian shop in the early 1960s, because they were arguing that why have this shop in African-American community that does not feature African-American and African and natural hair, right? And so they are contesting the presentation of Black bodies, similar to how Black bodies in these public spaces are seen as out of place, even in public places. And the brutal death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all of these ways in which in the work of Barbara Combs are Black bodies, quote unquote, out of place. But how these cultural and political movements challenge what's occurring in fundamental ways to place Black bodies in these places to bring about resistance. And then thirdly, this image of the Grandasa models from, I think, the 1967 Naturally extravaganza poster. They were posing for the poster. Notice that they sort of are playfully sort of taking up aspects of the self-defense posture of the 1960s of the Black Panther Party. Brandishing, smiling, but brandishing a rifle. Well, in 1967, the Black Panther Party took over the state capitol in Sacramento in defense of gun rights, right? So it might not have been incidental that this image would show up in this Grandazo model poster of 1967. Similar to sort of various African-American guns rights and self-defense organizations like NFAC, NFAC, taking up the cause of self-defense in this case on the 4th of July in Stone Mountain, Georgia, to contest the Stone Mountain generals and Confederate imagery of Stone Mountain, Georgia. Again, that is not a coincidence that that sense of self-defense and Black self-defense rooted in revolutionary nationalism would appear then and appear now. Not completely a coincidence. Let me conclude, however, by talking about the bookending my discussion with the activism of African-American women. So I talked about the ways in which there are these sort of clear connections between then and now, or if they're not clear connections, they are still frames that one movement might borrow from the other. Whether or not they know who are the radical foremothers of those ideas and images, that one movement can borrow from that movement lovingly to project new images. But there also is the question, and this arises out of the Say Her Name campaign, that inspired by the African American Policy Forum and Professor Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw. In what ways are African American women's lives still not seen? How their images, even though Black is beautiful, as portrayed by the Grandazo models then, was clearly a projection of how African American women can represent aspects of African American aesthetics and beauty, which is important and revolutionary in its own sense. How do we still have fundamental challenges about speaking the names of African American women as central to our movements in political, economic, and social aspects today? And in ways in which there is still, as I show from the Soras of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, still the individuals who are responsible for the death of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky have not been, in Tennessee, have not been apprehended, have not been arrested. The cops have not been arrested. So I wanted to sort of conclude to say that I hope I gave you some sense of snapshots of liberation, of how there are these things that we may have to further excavate of what was true then and true now in cultural practice and politics. But I welcome your questions and thank you for the opportunity. I'll turn you also to a few books just for your consideration. Barbara Ransby's book on Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. Then Tema Lopez Bonyasi, and Candace Watts-Smith, Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter. And then certainly the original work of, original essay by Alicia Garza, her story of the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, thank you. I welcome your questions.
Hey everyone, this is Wilson Boehm from the Columbia Museum of Art. I'm going to be reading off the questions for Dr. Shaw, and we'll start here with the first one. It's a request, actually. They're hoping that you could speak more on Carlos Cook and his associates and movement.
Well, okay, so Carlos Cook, again, was sort of part of this effort to extend the legacy of Garveyism. So Cook, in what would become by the early 1950s, founded the African National Pioneer Movement, the APNM, a sort of neo-Garvey movement in Harlem and with extensions into the Bronx that was rooted in the principles of Garveyism that said, well, we're going to fundamentally think Black. So that was one thing that Brathwaite talked about, how Carlos Cook was pivotal in his own thinking, that he gave him the sort of revolutionary idea of thinking Black. And so what does it mean to think Black? Meaning that you want to center yourself in your own sense of history, of culture, of your own sort of ancestral ties, which is very much Garveyism. Even though Marcus Garvey, in his own day, had a way in which he projected this notion of being pride in being of African descent. And Garvey's sort of projection of these images were often rooted partly in the frames of European culture. To see an image of Marcus Garvey in his field marshal uniform, he's wearing this sort of this British field marshal uniform as he is part of the UNIA sort of international convention, with sort of thousands of individuals part of the UNIA streaming down 125th Street in Harlem in this Garvey Day, in parade, celebrating this sense of connection to Africa. So even though Garvey's sort of imagery itself was not necessarily rooted in African image, his words were. He was profoundly talked about, and this is what influenced Cook's thinking, and then in turn influenced Brathwaite. So there's this notion of thinking Black, this notion of buying Black, another principle of Garveyism that Cook conferred onto Brathwaite. And Brathwaite. And in that sense, then, you would see in the Grandazzo or the naturally Black, to call them fashion shows is not quite correct. They were sort of cultural extravaganzas. And so you could see sort of some of the models actually holding the sign of Buy Black, or the Buy Black symbol, or the Buy Black placard in the background. Again, extensions of Garveyism that Carlos Cook was important. It wouldn't have Brathwaite wouldn't have taken up the charge without Cook in that regard. So I hope I addressed at least some of the importance of Cook to Brathwaite.
Thank you. So we're actually not seeing any more questions at the moment. So if anyone has a last, here we go. Here comes one now. Okay. To what degree did the Black natural hair movement and the Marvel Black Panther movie rekindle the ideas of Black is beautiful and fuel the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a fascinating question. So I would say that the Black Panther movement, the Black Panther movie came at a critical time, and we're still in that time, of Black political history, as is true in American history, right? So that with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, there certainly was a fundamental sense of reassessment in various African-American social movements about what is next. Now, this is not to argue that Black Lives Matter went away. In fact, let's just put it this way. Black Lives Matter preceded the Black Panther movement movie, in that Garza Opal Tometi and Patrice Cullors founded it in 2013, and the movie came out in 2018. But you're right to say that was there some fueling of sort of a fundamental sort of sense of what does it mean to be rooted in one's pride of being of African descent. It certainly did that. I would say that the Black Panther movie also helped to further stimulate a dialogue, a historic dialogue that's a Pan-African dialogue. I saw sort of through social media, I saw various discussions between persons who are of African descent and who are Native African about, so how do you pull apart these characters and figures within the film, particularly King T'Challa and Killmonger, his cousin, and sort of the pain of the struggles between these two men, and representing sort of the African-American longing, but feeling lost by Mother Africa, versus Mother Africa figuring out, well, how do I welcome my children? And that's sort of what those characters represent. So I would say that in some ways, yes, it helped to further dialogues in key ways. but in some ways, I would say maybe the Black Lives Matter movement fueled the Black Panther. I mean, I think in some ways that because they put sort of this, they began the seeds of this assessment about where do we go next, right? At a critical moment of quite frankly, disparagement in Black political history with the election of Trump, that in some ways folks could say, well, you know, there is still fundamentally, if we want to ask beyond the movie what we should do, Black Lives Matter is still here. Black Lives Matter is still a fundamental set of concerns about systemic racism. And so in some ways you could say that Black Lives Matter gave the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther movie filmmakers somewhere to go next, other than the importance of cultural celebration and self knowledge of self, which is critically important, but how to politicize aspects of that, I think, were key. It's clear also that the Black Panther movie also revived another sort of cultural genre of Afrofuturism. I could give another lecture on that, but yes. And it's clear that there were these Pan-African connections being made in that film, no doubt about it.
Great, thank you. Here's the next question. We have a couple more now. You have related Brathwaite to Black Lives Matter. Is there a relationship to the African-centered movement?
So yes, I would say so, and probably even more so, right? The African-centered movement, and by that is meaning that the 1960s, particularly from the mid-1960s forward, right? We have the emergence as one aspect of cultural nationalism, a turn to what would eventually become sort of the African-centered or Afrocentrism, Afrocentricity movement of various thinkers. Rooted in the 1960s, we have Ron Malana Karinga, with the US organization of the creation of the sort of the Kwanzaa Festival. This would inspire, as part of the aspect of that movement, the Shule movement, the African schools movement, of saying, well, in fact, integration is a fundamental problem to begin with because it's based on this premise of Black children, needing to sit next to white children, da da da. So it says, why can't we reinforce our own cultural ethic by creating the independent Black schools movement? The independent Black schools movement, and certainly what would also sort of dovetail into the creation of Black Studies and Africana Studies departments. And that is a sort of clear way in which the Brathwaite politics of the cultural politics of the early 1960s were down to the creation of institutions at various universities and often in school curricula. And so, and certainly by the early 1970s and into the 1980s, the founding of various sort of African-American or Black professional and scholarly associations across a whole range of things, including the African Heritage Association, the AHA, which is having its conference coming up. All of these things were outgrowths of that movement. But I wanted my charge to be of today to speak to the activism of today as much as possible. But you're absolutely right that the African-centered movement is the most direct outgrowth of that cultural politics of the early 1960s.
Great, thank you. Here's the next question. What can white Americans do to enact solidarity with Black Americans without appropriating and thus undermining the authenticity of Black Lives Matter?
Thank you. Excellent question. Not long ago, I had the great honor to write a piece that I entitled "More Than an Ally." And what I meant by that notion is that in order to be more than an ally, it's sort of centered around a concept that we as Black political scientists and various Black social psychologists have used. That concept is called linked fate. Linked fate says, I assess my well-being based on the well-being of a group. I am, therefore we are, we are, therefore I am, therefore I am connected to the greater whole. Well, to be more than an ally means that, is it possible to feel that you are linked, that your fate or well-being is linked to a group, even if you don't belong to that group, right? Even if you don't have membership or direct belonging in that group. And so I think that what the current moment of the Black Lives Matter protest is demonstrating, that linked fate can exist, but you're right that it still has to be very careful about not expropriating and removing the leadership of African Americans from this movement, displacing that leadership, right? And so we had this protest in Portland, Oregon, of the moms and the veterans, many of whom were predominantly who were white, protecting the Black Lives Matter protesters, some of whom were more of color, given the diversity of Portland, Oregon. But, and so what does it mean? It means in some respects that you ask, that you listen, that you fundamentally assume that we all have lessons to learn, but as an ally, you have a particular set of lessons to learn. That you realize that there can be privilege in being an ally, right? There's privilege and not belonging to the group on some level. We all have, in the words of Kathy Cohen in her notions of marginalization, we all have some relative degree of power. And so how do you exercise your power? And I think the current moment, unlike what happened in the civil rights movement that brought about the turmoil in the civil rights movement, is a time for us to relearn those lessons about, do I have to be in leadership? Do I have to be a spokesperson to be an ally? I would say no. I would say it'd be advisable you don't be that, but you recognize the role that you do have to play as an ally within that movement and connected to other communities who are not allies. So I hope that's a little bit helpful in giving you some sense about what allies can and should do.
Great, yes, thank you. And it looks like we have one last question. And everyone, if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. But I'll go ahead and read off this last one we have here. And they're asking about if there were, this is what women with natural hair can you tell us about that came to the political forefront prior to the 1960s?
That's an interesting question. And I have to, I'm going, as a scholar, you've got to also say when and where your knowledge ends. I will say, however, that let me say part of the inspiration for what would occur in the 1960s was certainly rooted in the cultural and hair politics prior to the 1960s. So you have this, biopic in part on the life and times of Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker is known quite well in my home city of Indianapolis because she left a cultural institution there in Indianapolis. But as you know, if you've had an opportunity to see that biopic, I think is it Netflix or so. And there are ways in which I've been advised by my sisters that there are ways in which it plays a fast and loose with a few historical facts. So don't take it as the absolute truth, but it does do a few things well, I think. One of which is to say that just simply African American women and Madam C.J. Walker building a cosmetics empire rooted in African American women as her salespersons across the nation. Just simply those women taking on the idea that we will have the ability to style our own hair and present ourselves in ways we feel represent our cultural aesthetic was powerful. Now, mind you that they were processing or treating that hair, right? But I think the roots of this question, the roots of the natural hairstyles have some linkage to that period because it's at least the principle, if not the practice. The principle being African-American women have control over their bodies. African-American women can determine their own standards of beauty. To paraphrase, in fact, the naturally 62 Ford cultural extravaganzas, can set their own standards of beauty. Do not have to contend effectively with the white world standard of beauty. So now, what's the actual sort of ways in which this moved forward? I would refer you to the work of Tanisha Ford, because I think Tanisha does an excellent job as a cultural historian to bring elements of that understanding of some of the seeds of where that those cultural politics existed even prior to the 1960s into our awareness. But that's partly my answer. It's not, I don't want to say that I've given you the best answer, but I suspect in looking for the answer, they're rooted in the principle of self-determination over one's bodies.
Great, thank you. And we do have one more question. Do you have any predictions on the ways in which culture and politics will intersect regarding the Black Lives Matter movement this fall?
Well, I think they're already intersecting in certain key ways. Let's keep in mind that it was aspects of the cultural movement that helped to further the fundamental claims against structural and systematic racism of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, excuse me, for instance, sports, right? Colin Kaepernick's protest, taking a knee at these games of the National Football League, clearly was an aspect of that cultural movement that we are thinking about even today, right? That the women of the National Women's the Women's National Basketball Association, that their protest is a cultural protest, is part of a cultural movement, because sports is yet another field for politics, right? And the fact that they're wearing Breonna Taylor's name across their jersey in protest to Senator Loeffler, who is their one of their main, main team owners, in their opposition, pardon me, in opposition to the ways in which she says that, well, displaying those images from Black Lives Matter are not appropriate. So I think some of what we will see is based on what we have already seen, and sports just being one version. Certainly, there'll be aspects to which we will see this sort of blowing up further by way of social media. Look for more grassroots activists and artists by way of the ways in which we're all consumed by way of by virtue of the pandemic. We're all consumed with social media, and so look for other artists to be projecting and keeping the movement claims alive and furthering the movement claims by virtue of sort of this mushroom of social media, of arts, of literature, of a whole range of things that will come into our world of view. But let me just say this one thing, which is the most powerful meme I think out there, or among the most powerful memes, let me be careful, is the meme that is continued to be recreated about "it is a good day to arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor." This meme here. So I think that will continue to pick up steam. And I think that and you can see sort of the range of ages of these women of Delta Sigma Theta, and various other sororities, fraternities, social organizations are all kind of picking up that image. See this as part of that cultural politics, right? Culture is about framing, because framing is the narrative in the short reason why you have a movement. And so what's to happen in this fall is probably based on what we're already seeing and new innovations. Not a short answer, but a good crack at it, or my attempt at it.
That's good.
Okay.
Okay. Drew in the background just told me that we have time for one more question. And I'm going to take these last two questions and ask them as one. It's from the same person. Do you believe that there will emerge a generation of young intellectuals, leaders, and activists that will be the progression of Blacks in our society in fundamental ways? And then the second part is, what about the arts? What will be the historical and social impact?
So I think there already has emerged this generation of activists. I'm looking, like yourself, I have so much more time to Zoom than I care to mention these days. And so I'm listening to various town halls, to various programs, a shout out to Cynthia Hardy's On Point program here in Columbia, where these young activists are there, and they have always been there. And these young activists and intellectuals are always there. There was young activists and intellectuals who brought forth this Million Man March that occurred in Columbia, South Carolina, in direct response to concerns about how the Black Lives Matter protests were being portrayed. So they are already here. Again, I'll refer you to, I won't reach down for it, but I'll refer you to the work of Sekou Franklin. In Franklin's book, After the Rebellion, that he gives a good sort of sense of well, but youth activism has gone back to the at least to the 1920s as we conceive of it. Certainly Black youth activism is rooted in the 1930s. There's always been this progression, and it exists today. In terms of cultural innovation, I'm going to leave that question to those who are more equipped to answer that, who have a better imagination or level of creativity than I do as a political scientist. But what I will say is that in some fundamental ways, because of the amplification that social media provides, that whatever that culture will look like for instance, this wonderful opportunity that the Columbia Museum of Art is providing. I would be doing this in person and maybe recorded, certainly maybe recorded, but now that this is in some ways broadcasted to the world, right? in ways that, that we're having to view things. So whatever those cultural innovations will be, that I'm certain will be there, whoever those cultural leaders and writers will be. That in some ways we have a amplification of new sets of media to get these things out, and so I can't tell you what they'll be. I can't give you a prediction of what they will be. I'll tell you what scholars often do, which is tell you something you already know, but we'll know them when we see them. And again, my suspicion is, some of what will be is based on what has already been.
All right, great. Well, that was the last question that we have for this talk. But we definitely want to thank you, Dr. Shaw, for that great lecture and for answering some of those questions as well. Thank you, everyone on Facebook who was involved with the questions, and for sharing your thoughts and your time today. I'll let Todd here sign us off. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, so thank you so very much for joining me this evening. And if you didn't get an opportunity to ask a question, I welcome them. I can talk with the Columbia Museum of Art about any other questions that might be follow-up questions. But I certainly hope you and your family remain safe. And again, thank you to all those at the CMA for this wonderful opportunity. I have thoroughly enjoyed it.